They called him a statue, a joke in a fuzzy hat, until he opened his mouth and silenced an entire parade ground with a single sentence. Before you judge a man by his uniform, you'd better hear this story all the way to the end. If you've ever doubted the meaning of tradition in a modern world, this video will challenge you. Smash that like button, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe for daily stories that reveal the real truth behind the symbols we think we understand. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for what the royal guard said when he was finally pushed too far. The low clouds of late November hovered over London's Horse Guards parade, painting everything in grey. Rain clung to cobblestone, and a solemn air hung over the square, as soldiers prepared for Remembrance Sunday. Among the murmuring tourists and veterans stood a man out of place. Dressed in an expensive navy coat, Lucas Grant, a self-important American academic, strutted through the crowd with a sense of superiority that turned heads. Lucas was no stranger to controversy. A Harvard-based podcast host and bell-selling author, he'd built a reputation tearing apart what he called military folklore. To him, the royal guards weren't soldiers. They were outdated props. Living mannequins in bearskin hats, he'd scoffed to anyone who would listen. As he waved at his cameraman to start filming, his voice cut through the respectful silence like a chainsaw. Veterans glanced sideways, mothers turned their children's heads, but Lucas didn't care. "Get the guy in the silly hat behind me," he chuckled to his assistant, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that his words were being heard by the very man he was ridiculing. That man was Sergeant Jonathan Reed. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But something in the way his grip shifted on his rifle hinted this was not going to end the way Lucas expected. The parade square pulsed with a quiet rhythm, flags fluttering, boots echoing on wet stone. Lucas Grant stood smugly in front of his camera, lecturing like it was a TED Talk. "Let me be clear," he said, facing the lens. "These guards behind me aren't warriors. They're living museum pieces, good for tourism but bad for budgets. Why pay millions for choreography?" His tone was mocking, laced with that arrogant tilt only a man armed with tenure and a following of 4 million podcast subscribers could wear. His assistant Zoe looked uncomfortable, glancing nervously at the veterans nearby. "You're really going with this angle?" she whispered. "Absolutely," Irene Lucas smirked. "This is the opener for Season 6, The Theater of War." And he did it. Lucas took 2 confident steps forward, over the boundary rope. Cameras clicked. A ripple passed through the crowd. One child gasped and tugged her father's sleeve. He turned to the ceremonial guard standing still just feet away. "Look at this man," Lucas proclaimed. "Does he look ready for a battlefield? He looks more suited for Buckingham Palace gift shop postcards." He laughed. The crowd didn't. But Sergeant Jonathan Reed, he didn't flinch. Rain hit the brim of his bearskin hat. His rifle remained at rest. Yet those who had served saw it, the slight repositioning of his stance. A signal. He was still a soldier. Lucas, emboldened by attention, pointed a finger. "I demand to know how much this man costs the British taxpayer." At that moment, the air shifted. Sergeant Reed moved. A rifle snapped to position with military precision. And then he spoke. "Sir, you've crossed into a restricted area. And what you're saying is not only wrong, it's offensive to every man and woman who's bled in service." The silence that followed, deafening. For a man used to controlling every conversation, Lucas Grant suddenly found himself speechless. The camera kept rolling, but his smirk vanished. The second Sergeant Jonathan Reed's voice rang through the air, deep, clear, and sharp as steel. "Step behind the line, sir," the sergeant repeated, "and know this. Your assumptions aren't just incorrect. They disrespect the sacrifices made by the very soldiers you mock." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Tourists turned. Veterans took a step forward. The tension was no longer subtle, it was electric. Lucas recovered just enough to counter. I'm a published researcher. My data suggests these ceremonial roles are outdated and drain millions from defense budgets that should be spent on drones, cybersecurity, real threats. Sergeant Reed didn't blink. My name is Sergeant Jonathan Reed, Coldstream Guards. I've served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan. My last deployment was 10 months ago. Before that, Fallujah. And before that, Helmand Province. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You call this a costume? These buttons were polished after carrying a wounded friend off the battlefield. This rifle is ceremonial today, but it's fired in real combat. And every man on duty here has earned the right to wear this uniform the hard way. A gasp escaped from someone in the crowd. Lucas tried again, but surely the cost. This time, a veteran interrupted. An older gentleman, cane in hand, medals heavy on his chest. You talk about cost, he barked. I fought beside these lads in Kandahar, watched them take positions no one else could hold. You think you understand numbers, but you don't understand blood. The crowd began to shift, now backing the guard. Lucas faltered, visibly shaken. But his academic pride flared. My podcast reaches millions. The public deserves the truth. And if these men are combat soldiers, where's the proof? That's when Zoe, his assistant, stepped forward holding her tablet. Lucas, he's right, she said quietly. I'm pulling live MOD records. These units rotate between ceremonial and combat duty. Their deployment rate is higher than regular infantry. Lucas went pale. Sergeant Reed finished the moment. Yes, we don't need to shout about our service, but we won't be disrespected either. You walked into our space, our duty, and tried to turn it into content. Well now, sir, you've become part of the story. The moment hung there. Lucas had nothing to say. He looked down at his notes, then at the crowd, then back at the soldier he had mocked. This man who had stood through bullets and ceremony now stood through ridicule and truth. For the first time, Lucas Grant had no rebuttal, just silence, and the echo of a guard's voice that had turned a myth into a man. Lucas Grant stood frozen, the pages of his research trembling slightly in his hand, not from the wind, but from something far more unsettling. Realization. He had come to the parade square armed with charts, podcast talking points, and the confidence of a man used to applause. But none of that prepared him for the truth, spoken not in anger, but with dignity by Sergeant Jonathan Reed. For the first time in the video, Lucas looked small, not because he was outnumbered, but because he was outmatched, not intellectually, but morally. The crowd around him was no longer filming with curiosity. They were watching with judgment. His argument had become tone-deaf, and he knew it. Zoe held up her tablet again. Lucas, she said, more gently this time, these reports from the Ministry of Defense, they show the Guard regiments you've criticized have had one of the highest deployment rates in the British Army over the last 15 years. Their ceremonial time? Less than 10% of total service hours. He took the tablet slowly, scanning the numbers. They didn't lie, but worse, they contradicted everything he'd built his brand on. He glanced back at Sergeant Reed, who had resumed his silent stance, unmoved and yet more human than Lucas had ever allowed himself to believe. I didn't know. Lucas muttered under his breath. Colonel Whitaker, a decorated officer who had joined the crowd, stepped forward. And that's the problem, isn't it? He said calmly. You thought because they stood still they did nothing. Because they wear red coats they weren't soldiers. But the truth is, the discipline you mock is the same that keeps their comrades alive in the worst moments of war. Lucas rubbed his temple, visibly deflated. His whole argument had hinged on the assumption that appearance meant irrelevance. But now, he couldn't deny it. Tradition had purpose, And this uniform had history stitched into every thread. "You were right about one thing," the colonel continued. "There is a story here, but it's not about waste or theater. It's about duality. The same hands that present arms in silence can also pull a wounded brother to safety under fire." A long silence followed. And then Lucas asked, almost sheepishly, Would I be allowed to speak to more of them off camera? Sergeant Reed, still standing tall, offered a slight nod. It wasn't permission, it was respect returned. Lucas turned to Zoe. "We have to rewrite the episode," he said. "This isn't a takedown piece anymore, it's a revelation." Zoe smiled. "That might be the first honest thing you've said today." The crowd slowly dispersed, but the shift had already taken place. Lucas Grant hadn't just changed his opinion. He'd surrendered his ego, and in doing so, took the first step toward actually understanding the people behind the pageantry. Lucas Grant sat in a quiet cafe just off Whitehall, the kind of place where military brass sometimes took their tea after long briefings. His overpriced coffee sat untouched, steam curling upward like a silent rebuke. He was staring blankly at the MOD deployment reports Zoe had printed out for him. Highlighted sections, dates, names, battle zones. Every line was a contradiction to his podcast episode's original thesis. Just 48 hours earlier, he had stood on the edge of Horse Guards Parade, declaring the Royal Guards to be nothing more than military decor. Now he knew the truth, and that truth was better than anything he could have scripted. "I want to scrap the episode," Lucas finally said, looking across the table at Zoe. "You want to pretend it never happened?" she asked cautiously. "No," he replied. "I want to start over. Same footage, same setting, but a new story. The one I didn't expect to find." He opened his laptop and began typing voiceover notes, new segment outlines, revised episode title. Episode 1, Behind the Bare Skin, The Dual Life of the Royal Guard. This time he wasn't going for controversy, he was going for truth. Later that afternoon, Lucas met with Sergeant Jonathan Reed again. This time off-duty, out of uniform, sitting across from him in a quiet military lounge. Gone was the stoic stillness. In its place was a calm, thoughtful man who spoke with the authority of someone who'd survived more than most civilians could imagine. They talked about combat rotations, PTSD, the strange tension between being a living symbol and a trained killer. Lucas listened, truly listened. For once in his career, ceremonial duties don't make us soft, Sergeant Reed said. They sharpen us. You can't fake precision, and in war, precision saves lives. Lucas nodded, scribbling notes. But not everything went in the notebook. Some things you don't quote, you just carry. The episode was rewritten, re-recorded, released under the title Guardians of Two Worlds, The Truth Behind the Ceremony. And it went viral, not for the reasons his usual content did. There were no clickbait attacks, no smug takedowns, just a rare thing in today's world. Humility. A man admitting he was wrong. And learning. The comment section lit up. "This is the most human I've ever seen, Lucas. Respect. As a veteran, thank you for getting this one right. My dad served in the household division. You nailed it." Lucas had finally found something bigger than his brand, a truth that mattered. And it all started with one guard who didn't move until it mattered most. For the first time in his public life, Lucas Grant stopped talking long enough to grow. After the viral turnaround of his podcast episode, media outlets began to request interviews, not to debate, but to commend. Headlines shifted. Outspoken academic admits he was wrong, and it made his work better. But the real change wasn't in the headlines, it was in Lucas himself. He no longer strutted through spaces with that untouchable intellectual confidence. He walked slower now. He listened harder. He realized that truth isn't found in sound bites. It's found in silence, in humility, and in the eyes of those who've seen things he'll never understand. Weeks after the incident, Lucas was invited by the Ministry of Defense to observe training exercises, not ceremonial drills, but full-blown combat readiness maneuvers with the Coldstream Guards. It was the same regiment Sergeant Jonathan Reed belonged to. He watched them move through obstacle courses, simulate urban warfare, lead room-clearing exercises with terrifying precision. These weren't actors. They weren't pageant props. These were warriors, and the contrast to their ceremonial presence only deepened Lucas's respect. During a break, he sat beside Sergeant Reed once again, this time in muddy fatigues, rifle slung, sweat pouring from under his helmet. "You look different out here," Lucas remarked. Reed chuckled. "Funny, people always say I look more real in uniform. I feel more real out here." Lucas asked hesitantly, "Do you ever feel resentful about doing ceremonial work?" The sergeant paused, then looked out across the training field. "Not once. Ceremonial duty is part of our identity. It connects us to history. It teaches discipline. When we wear that red coat, we're honoring every man who wore it before us, and those we lost. It reminds us why we fight." That answer stuck with Lucas. So did something else, the grit beneath the polish, the sacrifice beneath the silence. He started integrating interviews with service members into his future episodes, shining a light on stories that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with honor, loss, and legacy. His podcast was no longer about proving others wrong. It was about discovering what's right. Older listeners especially resonated with this shift. Veterans wrote in, grandparents who once served shared stories, wives of fallen soldiers thanked him. One even sent him a folded flag with a letter. "My husband served in the Coldstream Guards. He would have wanted you to know that what you said before hurt, but what you said after healed. Thank you for seeing him." Lucas framed that letter. In 1 year, he went from a man known for confrontation to a man respected for compassion, all because he had the courage to admit he was wrong and the willingness to grow. In Sergeant Reed, he continued standing tall both in ceremonial silence and battlefield chaos. He didn't need validation, but thanks to Lucas he got something better, recognition. It was a cold December morning in London when Lucas Grant returned to Horse Guards Parade, not as a critic this time, but as a quiet observer. He stood at the back of a small crowd, no camera, no script, just a man trying to understand what he once dismissed. And there he was again, Sergeant Jonathan Reed, standing still, silent, impeccable in his red tunic and bearskin cap. But now, Lucas didn't see a costume, he saw a soldier. He remembered the first time he mocked that uniform, called it a waste, a relic, military theater. He remembered the smirk on his face, the arrogance in his voice. And he remembered the moment Sergeant Reed stepped out of silence and into history. That moment had changed everything. Lucas stood among veterans now, some with walkers, others in wheelchairs. Many wore medals, none wore pride on their sleeve. They carried it in their silence, just like Reed. He realized these men weren't just soldiers of war. They were guardians of legacy. It struck Lucas that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't ignorance, it's the refusal to see beyond appearances. He had done that, but he wasn't the same man anymore. The ceremonial changing of the guard began, and a hush fell over the crowd. The stomp of boots, the rifle flip, the precision so flawless it could bring tears to a drill sergeant's eyes. Lucas didn't film it. He didn't need to. He was finally present. Afterward, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Lucas stepped forward, just close enough to be seen but not cross the line. He raised a hand in acknowledgement. And Sergeant Reed, he didn't move. He didn't need to, because now Lucas understood. Some men speak with words, others speak with silence, and silence, when earned, can be louder than any podcast, louder than any protest, louder than any parade. Lucas went home and recorded a new episode, not about controversy, but about humility, about how one man's stillness had revealed a nation's heartbeat, about how tradition and modernity aren't enemies, they're partners in remembrance, sacrifice, and duty. He titled the episode, "The Man in the Red Coat," and in the description he wrote, "I once called him a mannequin, but he's more soldier than I'll ever be. This one's for Sergeant Jonathan Reed, and every man and woman who serves in silence." That episode remains the most downloaded one of his career, because it didn't just inform, it inspired. As you were in the guard's boots, what would you do? Imagine standing motionless for hours, in full ceremonial uniform, every move scrutinized by cameras, tourists, and critics. You've served your country in war zones, seen things you'll never speak of. But here, people only see the hat. Now, imagine someone stepping into your space, mocking your role, your uniform, your service, questioning your worth without knowing your story. What would you do? Would you snap? Would you yell? Would you break the stoic silence you were trained to hold? That's the situation Sergeant Jonathan Reed faced. But he didn't explode. He didn't shove. He didn't retaliate. He simply spoke truth calmly and with strength in the exact moment when it mattered most. "Sir, you've crossed into a restricted area, and what you're saying is not only wrong, it's offensive to every man and woman who's bled in service." In that instant, he didn't just defend tradition. He defended every soldier's unseen story, life lesson, what tradition teaches us about character. This story isn't just about military protocol, it's about what we choose to respect in life and what we dismiss too quickly. So many of us, especially in modern culture, are conditioned to equate stillness with uselessness, formality with falseness, and tradition with waste. But this tale teaches us something crucial. Tradition isn't the opposite of progress. It's the foundation that supports it. Sergeant Reed reminded us that sometimes the most powerful people aren't the loudest in the room. Sometimes the strongest man is the one who stands quietly, knowing who he is, not needing to prove it. To older viewers, veterans, grandparents, those who've lived through wars and political change, this resonates deeply. You've seen tradition misrepresented. You've seen sacrifice forgotten. But here, tradition stood up for itself, with dignity, with clarity, without losing control. Real life application. What can you take from this? If someone questions your value, your career, your background, your beliefs, how do you respond? Do you shout back, get defensive, walk away? Or do you stand firm in what you know is true and let your actions, your record, and your character do the talking? This story challenges all of us, especially older Americans who've been through hardship, to remember respect is not owed to uniforms or titles. It's owed to the lives lived inside them. Truth does not always win through volume. It wins through courage, grace, and fact, spoken at the right time. Legacy matters. Whether you served in the military, raised a family, taught in a school, or worked a job with honor for 30 years, you've built something, and just because someone younger might not understand it, doesn't mean it isn't real. So here's the real question. When your values are questioned, will you crumble, or will you stand like Sergeant Reed? Let this story remind you, you don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to fight to be respected. Sometimes the greatest strength is in standing tall, still, silent, and sure of who you are. We'd love to hear from you. On a scale of 1 to 10, how powerful was this story for you? Have you ever had your beliefs challenged by unexpected truth? If you were in Sergeant Reed's place, what would you have done? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let's talk about it. Your experience might inspire someone else. And if this story moved you, please like this video. Subscribe for more real-life stories that challenge the way we think. Turn on the bell so you never miss the next powerful moment. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that stillness isn't weakness, it's strength.